believe that we need a union to be an intermediary between us and our employees.
Let me congratulate the Amazon Labor Union in Staten Island for their extraordinary victory. For the very first time, they were successful in organizing a union at an Amazon facility. And this is an independent union with almost no financial resources. And they were successful in taking on one of the largest corporations in this country, owned by Jeff Bezos, one of the wealthiest people in this country. And what that victory in Staten Island tells me is that working people all over this country are sick and tired of seeing corporate profits soaring. They're seeing billionaires become much richer, and yet they don't have adequate wages, adequate benefits, adequate working conditions. My guess is that this victory in Staten Island will not only mean more organizing at Amazon facilities around the country, I think it's going to be a shot in the arm for the labor movement, and you could see more and more workers stand up and say, you know what? We want justice on the job. We also are going to form a union. So once again, congratulations to the Amazon employees in Staten Island. What you did is extraordinary. It'll impact the entire country. Thank you.
Hell yeah.
Cheers.
Oh shoot. I wasn't ready.
Oh, sorry. I'll hold off. Do this collectively.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers. That's so fucking awesome.
Yeah, this was pretty wild, and I think to the extent I'm an insider, it makes it even more wild that this won. It's just one of the most unexpected kind of labor victories that you'll ever see. Probably, well, hopefully not in our lifetime, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's just one of the most surprising you could possibly imagine.
Well, with any luck, they'll start to get more expected is the difference, but yeah.
Yeah, just another 16,000 person warehouse organized this week. No big deal, right?
Yeah.
So, hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so this is Give Them an Argument. I am Ben Burgess. This is our union, Jake, our producer, Jake Appett, CWA organizer by day. This is our graphic designer, J. Andrew World, responsible for all the wonderful thumbnails you see. And that, of course, was Grandpa Sanders celebrating this victory, which is what we're going to be getting right back to in about 90 seconds. And that's where we're going to be at for pretty much the next 20 minutes or so of the show. So I do want to say a couple things before we get to that. So one of them is that the main event today is going to be an unlocked interview with Jesse Spafford, who is a research fellow at Trinity College Dublin, who wrote a really interesting paper about community as a socialist value. So patrons got to see that already, but everybody else gets to see that as the main event today. After that, I'm going to be talking to Jed a little bit about my new book, the Academic Philosophy book. And in the post game, we have Matt McManus, our good friend and comrade, who is going to be on. We're actually going to talk about a lot of other stuff, but he's going to be on to have a little bit of fun with a new PragerU Leo and Layla video. So that should be a very good time. Remember, if you're not a GTAA patron yet, you get to make sure you see that post-game, every other patron-exclusive post-game, access to the Discord server, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most importantly, our love and gratitude for helping to support the work we do here. For $5 a month, you can go over to patreon.com/Ben Burgess and do that. Two other things before we get back to the main event here. So one is that I am going to be in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, like America, but further up, that one. So for a couple of events on April 21st and 22nd. So this is the first one, which is a reading and signing Q&A. We threw a drinking on there event at the Duke of York pub for the new book, the Hitchens book. That's general admission. Just show up. The other one is the next night on April 22nd. I am going to be giving a talk on the relationship between Marx and philosophical liberalism at what is for now still known as Ryerson University. They're changing the name. They haven't changed it yet. So that one is taken in. Tickets are free, but I just want to keep track of how many people are coming. So we have the link to all of that in the description for this episode. Okay, with that, there's really only one thing we can talk about right now. So, Jake, take it away.
Sure. So I want to open it up to get your thoughts eventually, but I just want to maybe underscore a little bit why this is. You probably hear the phrase David versus Goliath, being thrown around so much. But I want to underscore for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with why this is such a ridiculous David versus Goliath story. This really all starts with Christian Smalls, who was an Amazon worker at, I believe he might have been technically a manager, although he said that he was passed up for promotion a bunch at a warehouse in Staten Island. And he was basically fired in retaliation for starting a protest against the company's coronavirus policies. So he basically staged a walkout, and then they made up some bullshit reason to fire him, where they said something like, oh, he didn't follow the coronavirus policy himself because he went back after testing positive, some stuff like that, which is pretty ridiculous. Yeah, I agree. Registered badass, probably one of the most badass people in the history of in history, as we'll get to. So yeah, the reason that this is so wild, right, is like there was 2 union organizing drives going on at Amazon warehouses, right, and they're probably different. They're different geographically, and there's a whole bunch of different scenarios going on, right? But one was in Bessemer, Alabama, and one was on Staten Island, right? So the one in I say here because I'm in New York, but the one started by Christian Smalls is basically after he was fired, he went.
Yeah, but I know where you live in New York, so I don't know how here Staten Island could be.
Yeah. I rightly called out for that. I'm not a Staten Island resident. I probably will not be going there anytime soon. But unless it's to support like an action at this warehouse,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
But anyway, so after he was fired, he basically decided to start his own union. He started the Amazon Labor Union. So this is an independent union, completely worker-run. Christian Smalls, a fired worker, is the president. And I believe the vice president is his friend who still works at Amazon, Derek Palmer, right? So the 2 of them started this like completely grassroots independent union, right? And at the same time in Bessemer, the workers there were working to organize with RWDSU, which is the retail workers union, right? So at the same time, you had 2 union drives where and I'm not trying to cast any aspersion about what was going on in Alabama. It's, famously hard to organize in the South, but at the same point, you had tons of staff hacks like myself. A staff hack is what I refer to myself, jokingly refer to people like myself who are union bureaucrats who are paid to help organize, right? Versus the Amazon union in Staten Island was completely independent, completely worker run. I think they had like one lawyer on loan from OPEIU, who was like working basically like on his off time. They had little to no professional staffers, and they were taking on Amazon, who disclosed because they legally had to disclose that they spent $4.3 million on anti-union meetings for just Staten Island. Right?
Has anybody broke down what that is per worker?
No, imagine it reminds me of like.
This got to be up there with Jeb Bush. Like those breakdowns of like how much money Jeb Bush had spent for every vote that he actually got in Iowa, New Hampshire.
Yeah, and it reminds me of those Bloomberg figures, right? For how much he actually like could have just paid us. Like at a certain point, you're like, just pay us to be mayor, man. Like at that point, I just want to see some of the money. Sorry about that, but got some celebratory dinner coming in, but anyway, so I mean, it's pretty wild, right? The degree to which they spent money to trying to kill this union. And the last thing I want to say about why this is so wild is admitted by tons of my colleagues is like labor bureaucrats who are good people and do a lot of great victories, right? And are work full time and strategizing about this stuff, everyone would have said that this wasn't going to work. And we could get a little into the details of like why by the metrics this made no sense. But one thing is like, Jane McAlevey, who's a great her famous book on labor strategy is called No Shortcuts, right? And they took shortcuts. They took shortcuts. Like one thing, for example, is you're legally, if you have 30% of a unit on cards, which means like signed up saying that they're pro-union, you're allowed to file. But as a labor organizer, I would only file if we had 70%, or that's like the ground rule.
Right.
Not only did they not have 30, but when they first filed, not only did they only have 30, but when they first filed, they had less than 30. So they're like, oh shit, need some more signatures. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they had to go back. So that never would have worked, right? And like, there's just all like Jane has this concept called a structure test where you're supposed to test like the strength of your group. You're supposed to, there's other things where you're supposed to have like 10% of the workforce on a committee. So that's really hard with 8,000 people, but they didn't have an 800 person worker committee. They had about 100, which is great, but we could here's the math. Based on 5,000 workers, Amazon spent 860, so there's just so much shit to go into here, but like suffice it to say, this was just unprecedented. And if you read about how they did it, basically they worked really hard. Like, Christian Smalls himself, wasn't just him. There was 100 workers on the committee, but like basically he stood at the bus stop outside where the Amazon workers would come in and just talk to people for like 10 hours a day. You know what I mean? So it was really just one-on-one conversations and food. Like they just like had a lot of really awesome like cookouts and like events where they would have food. Like, for example, I saw that like there was a lot of African workers. So they said like, oh, we got this special kind of rice that the workers love. So they came up and there's a good Jacobin article with an interview with one of the organizers, but really it was just being personable. And also, we talk a lot about third partying the union, which is when the company tries to, so you saw Jeff Bezos in the beginning was like, you don't need an intermediary, right? The one thing about being an independent labor union is they were like, this is just fucking us. Like I'm on my break right now. Or like, I'm actually like, this is my off day. And I'm supposed, I could be at home with my kid, but I'm here talking to you. I'm working on this 7 days a week because it's so important to me. So what they lacked in resources, because they're not an established labor union, they made up for in the fact that it was just incredibly authentic and personable, and they couldn't third party them. And apparently that backfired for Amazon because, you know how we say they never deviate from their script. So their script was, this is a third party. And then the worker came up to them and said, hey, how are you guys allowed in here? And they're like, oh, here's my badge. So then it was kind of like, that backfired. Where normally if it was like some asshole like me, they'd be like, who's Jake Appett? He's like some leftist agitator who wants you all to like, join his struggling union business. No, it was just like, that's my buddy who I work, 10-hour shifts with, who like his feet hurt just like my feet after like a 10-hour day in which we get like, 15-minute breaks here and there. So we could get into, what their demands were and stuff like that. But the last thing I wanted to highlight those, talking about why he's a registered badass. We have a tweet here from Christian Smalls. Amazon wanted to make me the face of the whole unionizing efforts against them. Well, there you go. Jeff Bezos, David Zapolsky, congratulations. We worked, had fun, and made history. ALU for the win became the first union in America for Amazon. So the backstory to this is pretty dope. This is like one thing I want people to take away is after he did the walkout, Amazon had a closed door meeting where the meeting notes eventually got leaked. And the reason he tagged this guy Zapolsky is because he apparently, like in a memo to Bezos and like this whatever senior staff said, hey, this guy Christian Smalls, he's not particularly smart or articulate, not a dog whistle at all, right?
Right.
And if possible, we should make him the face of the labor of the union movement at Amazon. We should make him the face of it. So Christian Small said, you know what, motherfucker, I'm going to become the face of it. And this guy basically went sicko mode. Like, the thing is, like, I mean, obviously it's not just one person, but I wonder if that didn't get leaked, if he would have fought as hard as he did. I mean, he seems like an amazing guy, so maybe he would have. But like, I'm just sure also as like a black man in America, just like those slights that you would get, like you're not smart, you're not articulate. Like, well, who's smart and articulate now? You know what I mean? Like he pulled off one of the craziest labor upsets in history, and he's just a real guy, and he comes across really authentic, and he's not like media trained. I mean, maybe by now he is, but he's not completely polished. He doesn't sound like he's talking in sound bites. So yeah, with that, I could also post. There's a little video of when they won, and you could see for yourself, Chris talking, and see the type of guy that he is.
Yeah, let's.
Union American history.
Yeah.
Man, I ain't gonna cry right now, but damn, 2 years ago, my life changed forever. I only wanted to do the right thing and speak up for the workers behind me. We got the juggler. We went for the juggler. And we went for the top dog because we want every other industry, every other business to know that things have changed. We gonna unionize. We're not gonna quit our jobs anymore. And this is a prime example of what the power that people have when they come together.
Yeah, and before I throw it to y'all, I just have two more quotes from this guy, because he's actually kind of a gold mine of quotes. One was while they were counting the votes. You see, Emmanuel Myberg says we should start a chant out of this, but. So Lauren Gurley is a labor reporter. She says, I just spoke to Chris Smalls, president of ALU. The union is currently leading 738 to 600. He said of Amazon's lawyers in the vote count room, I love watching them squirm. They're drinking mad water. And after they won, this has kind of become the classic quote, but he said, we just want to thank Jeff Bezos for going to space, because while he was up there, we were signing people up, and it's obviously a joke because he was up in space for like 15 seconds. So like, it's just like a fuck you, but like, he's just, like whatever you think of him, he's real, and he's like a very effective leader. So yeah, no, I want to throw to you guys like any thoughts about, this kind of wildly grassroots organizing campaign.
I gotta say, like Staten Island, there's just something magical about Staten Island, because they gave us the Wu-Tang Clan and the Amazon Union. So and they both were like totally independent, came up on their own. So there's a lot of parallels there with the Wu-Tang Clan.
Yeah,
Wu-Tang.
Yeah, no, makes sense to me.
Yeah.
The only time I've been to Staten Island, really, I guess I went there once to meet a friend at a pizza place, but otherwise is to see Sean Richmond, who's been a guest on the show, who's a labor historian who actually has interesting things to say about all this. Maybe we'll have him on at some point to talk about it. Wrote a really good book called "Tell the Bosses That We're Coming." But I guess
watch that episode too, which we did have him on before, right?
Yeah, we had him on. It was with it was the same episode that when Nathan was on to talk about being fired from the Guardian. He was on just before that. I think that was the
So go back, watch that episode when you're done here. After you subscribe and watch the post game, just block us out. We're just going to be everywhere.
That's right. But I guess my initial thought, like hearing Christian Smalls talk about 2 years ago, and I think this does go to just what a grassroots thing it is, right? I mean, that's the president of the ALU. That I remember hearing Christian Smalls speak 2 years ago, but where I was listening to him was on the Zero Books podcast, where he was being interviewed by Doug Lane, then Zero editor and now Sublation Media editor, and. I mean, this is this is not exactly, like, I mean, whatever. I mean, I've been on the Zero Books podcast a bunch of times, right? I mean, this is a, you know, I mean, this is not exactly, you know, it's not exactly being on CNN, you know, and I think that's got to be one of the first places he was telling that story, you know, back in 2020. So yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I also saw a really interesting comment from that's been going around. I'm sure you guys have probably seen it from Justine Medina, who was on the ALU organizing committee. She's a packer at the JFK warehouse, said, who's describing, well, here's what she says. My quick and dirty analysis of the Amazon labor union successes so far is pretty simple. We just did the thing you're supposed to do. We had a worker-led movement. We studied the history of how the first major unions were built. We learned from the industrial workers of the world, and even more from the building of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. We read William Z. Foster's Organizing Methods in the Steel Industry. So that is a pretty good cut. You know, that's you know, William Z. Foster was one of the primary leaders of the, you know, Communist Party USA in the glory days, and, you know, and obviously the sort of most important person behind their labor strategy. So yeah, I mean, I think it's inspiring in a lot of ways, right? And I do think, like, as you say, you know, no shade on anybody involved in the organized effort of Bessemer, the very different environments, and, you know, and all that stuff. But I do think, like, it probably is important that that this was, you know, that this was like an organic effort, you know, in Staten Island, you know, that, I mean, the sort of, like, you know, I mean, also probably tells you something about how, like, a victory, you know, Bessemer might actually, you know, happen, since a lot of what I was hearing later was about kind of cultural disconnect, right? You know, that sort of bring in people who are like Hamilton loving Elizabeth Warren voters to, you know, to try to organize, and, you know, in Bessemer, it didn't quite work, you know, but yeah, no, I mean, I think it is fucking fantastic. It is amazing. That this was just this little indie labor union that, you know, was organized from scratch 2 years ago. That they had they were going back, and, you know, the fact they were reaching back further than, you know, I mean, again, Jane McKell is a, you know, it's a genius, right? That's not the question, but they have but I got to say, I do find it interesting, right, that they were reaching back further than that, right? I mean, like, you know, like, they weren't reading No Shortcuts. They're reading Organizing Methods in the Steel Industry by William Z. Foster. And you know, that might be, you know, there might be a little bit of wisdom there too, right? You know, that you know.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that I think my biggest takeaway for this, just for the left in general, was not, I would, you know, be wary of people being like, this is what we know because of this one thing, right?
Yeah,
but what I would say, though, is just like a multiplicity of tactics is something I've taken away from it. Because remember, like, when AOC was taking on Crowley, it was like, she can never win. You know what I mean? And it was like, you know, when a few upstart worker organizers at Amazon Staten Island are taking on the biggest, you know, the richest fucking guy on the planet, it's like they'll never win. And, you know, a lot of times these fights don't work, but if we don't even try, then there's no chance. And I think, you know, and I didn't know that they were reading those books. That's fascinating to me, because I was like, there's no way that they just reinvented everything from scratch, right? You can't just like chat, you know, you can't just like have a chat and you know, and do organizing that way. But it sounds like you said, they were pulling from some really cool sources themselves, right? So it's just like, I think it's a little easy for us to get stuck in like, this is the only way that this can work. And when the left is like receding for how long, right? I think we just can't get stuck in like, oh, my way is the only way that, or the way we've been trying things for the last 30, 40 years is the only way we're going to dig ourselves out of this hole, because we got to try things that people thought were impossible, or else I don't really know if the left has any chance without that, you know. Like, if we can't take on big fights and win them, then what are we going to do, you know?
Totally. And I mean, in some ways, I think the whole environment has gotten so dismal that, like, going back and looking at what people were doing before they this sort of current framework of labor law and what all of that has meant, for the last 90 years almost, might actually, might be getting to the point where that's a useful move to make. And I guess thinking about, that episode that we did with Sean Richmond, like one of the, he uses this kind of analogy at the beginning of that book about thinking about, sort of, and I mean, like, whatever. I mean, some of the stuff he's questioning there is like much more basic than, than I think even the difference between like what ALU did in Staten Island and, what Jane McKelvey is recommending and, and no shortcuts. But I think that, but he's sort of talking about like trying to think about like, okay, what we think of about how, organizing works, what it like union shop even looks like, et cetera, that, is sort of based on, he's got this like elaborate analogy. I don't think it's original to him. I mean, I think it's a long-standing thing, but he has this analogy about, this like, grandma's roast or whatever, you learn to make it a certain way. And then there's like this thing that doesn't, you don't quite know why it's that way. And, you ask this sort of chain of people, like why it's that way until you get to her. And it's like, I don't know. Like that's the way I had to do it because like the pad that I was using, that like there's a lot that you just sort of don't question because it's just kind of how things are done, and I think that the same way that it can be useful to look at what's happened in like just totally different contexts in other countries, etc. I mean, I think going back and looking at what, like somebody like Foster, who in some ways really was kind of trying to figure it out, from scratch, right? That like that's what I saw in Sean's thread about William Z. Foster after Justine said that, that like in some ways, like he was one of the innovators of sort of organizing as we now know it, that, like somebody like, Bill Haywood in the IWW or whatever, like he was sort of like, he was like a speech maker, right? He was like, that was like TV before workers had TV, but like in terms of this sort of like grind of like having conversations with workers and everything, like he was kind of helping to innovate that. So anyway, all of which is just to say, maybe I don't want to go too cargo cult on this and say like whatever particular thing was being done in this one successful campaign in this one place is what everybody has to, do for all time forever here. But maybe there is something to be learned just for the sort of general spirit of like going back and looking at earlier models.
Yeah, and look, there's one thing that anyone would tell you, which is like the more worker-led a movement is, the more chance it has for success. So maybe the possibility for that investment wasn't quite there, right? Like I've had, like, that's always my goal when I'm approaching any workplace is not really for me to organize the workplace, but just to help the worker organizers organize their own workplace. But sometimes, you get to a place where you're like, they're not quite there. And, or maybe I'm not good enough in my job, but that's the goal. You know what I mean? So if that exists without me, then that's fucking awesome. Like, that's great. But yeah, no, totally. It's something that we're going to be analyzing for a while. So Ben, I know we're going to get to the interview soon. Do we have? No, I had a couple clips of just like going forward in case on the topic of whether. Well, first of all, Andy sent this meme. If you want to
nice.
Say it for the podcast listeners, Andy.
I should have done first. Yeah, it starts off with a picture of Bart Simpson with the label of Jeff Bezos, and it says, "This was the worst day of my life." And Homer is labeled as the Union, and he's saying, "The worst day of your life so far."
Yeah. So obviously, a lot of preview of what's to come, but a lot of people are freaking out over this. So I just wanted to quickly end on the note that, maybe we're in a moment, right? Ben, you sent this to me, but, on the topic of Starbucks, they must be at like 200 locations right now. And their flagship store in New York City, which is like called a roastery or something. I had no idea what that was, but they voted like, look how many workers they.
Yeah, that's why there are 82 workers at one Starbucks, because you're thinking like they're just selling coffee. It's like, what the hell, right? But yeah, they're actually like roasting beans and stuff. That's part of the explanation of why it's so many. But yeah, this is their main store in New York, and that's just you guys. Amazing.
Yeah, so that wave is going. I have a short clip of Schultz. He's back to being the interim CEO because we saw how good he was. Some folks can watch an earlier segment we did about his weird Holocaust metaphor to try to bust the union. So he's back. So hopefully has some more Schindler's List style analysis. But yeah, this is him whining.
Now, here's where it gets a little sensitive because I've been coached a little bit. But I do want to talk about something pretty serious. We can't ignore what is happening in the country as it relates to companies throughout the country being assaulted in many ways by the threat of unionization.
Being assaulted, and he's like, he says, I've been coached. What
Amazing.
the fuck is it? So I have been coached, but I am going to deviate from my prepared remarks to say something really stupid. Yeah. No.
Anytime that man reaches for a microphone, just give it to him because it's going to be gold.
The assault. I think another Schultz quote was, "They're taking our people." Our people, our precious people, at Starbucks, they call them partners, our business partners. And I have one more whining segment for you all from Jim Cramer, who I think Ben.
Oh my God! Yes.
Yeah.
I think Howard want to work with people and explain why the union may not be the best option. He gave a long speech in Buffalo about it. He's an passionate guy. He has the level of bearing that few people in the world have. And I think he can really talk about how it's such a great place to work. He'll do a good job.
We got beat up a little bit for our discussion on Amazon on Friday that we didn't appreciate, I guess, union life and how its importance in American working life.
Well, I belonged to 2 unions in my life. Helped lead a wildcat strike. Probably ill-advised, by the way. A lot of people fired. And my experience is that if you have a union that's adversarial, then you can't protect your people. And I look unions to be great in this very stressful situation, but Elon Musk doesn't have unionized people, and I think he puts out great product, and I don't see a return of it.
Yes, Elon Musk, who oversees famously excellent working conditions.
Yes.
No union there.
No, and I mean, honestly, Jim Cramer was so much better when he was on cocaine. Just give him back nose candy.
Yeah.
Let him
Very
go.
low energy. I want to see coked up Wild Strike leading Jim Cramer or Wildcat Strike. I think in another clip too, he repeated some really common anti-union talking points. I mean, we've been at this before, where one of the way you know that someone's about to say some bullshit is like, I'm not anti-union, but right, and that was what Cramer pulled right there. Of the listen, I've been involved with unions. I led one very ill-advised labor. Maybe the problem with that union was Jim Cramer, right? It sounds like he has been part of a lot of, given some really bad advice in a lot of different segments. But
I actually do have a little bit of insight into this, because I do know one incredibly fun fact about Jim Cramer that in my experience most people don't know, which is that when he was in college, he was a member of the Spartacus League, which is this tiny, weird, revolutionary Marxist sects. They publish a newspaper called Workers' Vanguard. People may have seen, you might see them in, if you're watching a video of Noam Chomsky giving a lecture, and somebody gets up during the Q&A with a piece of paper, and they instead of asking a question, they read off some pre-prepared statement denouncing him as a tool of imperialism or something. Right? That's the Spartacus League, of which Jim Cramer was once a member. So yeah,
I'd love to hear him to have his Spartacus League discussions with Alan Dershowitz, who he was on part of his student-led legal team. That was an important defense case that he took from some rich guy that they based the movie Reversal of Fortune on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I'd be just, I think that'd be awesome. Like, to have
Klaus von Bülow.
Yes.
Yes.
So I just,
he has a bit of a Forrest Gump like ability to turn up in strange places. But yeah, no, just wanted to enjoy some of the capitalist whining. But I think overall my pitch would be that we as socialists focus a lot on labor uprising and the working class, partially because it's strategic, but normally it's not really pragmatic for most people to get involved with labor. And most, I think it's kind of been severed, the connection between the average person and any kind of labor struggle, right? But it seems like labor struggle is coming to a town near you soon, right? Even if it's not your workplace, there's going to be like in New York City, I know we have rallies in support of all the Starbucks stores that are organizing. So it's a good time, I think, for the left. We gotta be there, and at the very least, just like be bodies and maybe help hand out food, because that seems to be maybe the number one way to reach people's hearts. But just kind of be there and embed ourselves, right, and learn and pick things up and help where we can, because we don't want to have this wave happen and just be like, oh, we missed it, or I sat out, so hopefully this is like a sign of some kind of major sea change.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I do want to just, that's so good. I almost don't want to step on the closing, but I'm going to do it a little bit.
Your show, man. Step on the closing.
Yeah, but there's a ribbon to this. I don't want to fuck it up. But yeah, no, but I think I do want to just kind of underline that point about, we talk about it so much because it's strategic, that for everything almost, right, that we want, right? That's like right at the heart of it, right? And like I do mean like almost everything. Like look, you're concerned about marginalized groups, about discrimination and prejudice. Well, I think you'll find that like leading people on vision quests about their prejudice is not actually a very effective strategy, but like giving people more money and making it harder to fire them, like if their boss like shares one of those prejudices, actually is a pretty effective strategy for making people's lives better who are on the other end of it. I think certainly, in terms of gender equality, the data is overwhelming there, about closing pay gaps, unionized workplaces, certainly in terms of, the sort of trajectory of, what, we think of, right, as, quote unquote, the black middle class as it came into existence in the mid-20th century onwards, right? So much that had to do with the giant industrial unions, and that people like William Z. Foster were organizing, stuff like the postal unions, and yeah, in terms of our longer term goals, and I don't even mean long term like smash capitalism, workers control the means of production. I mean like medium term, right? In terms of even like medium term goals, like this is something that you just cannot accomplish otherwise, right? You're not going to, the reason we don't have Medicare for all is not that, like, I don't know, whatever, like some like attention grabbing Congress member hasn't been yelled at enough by the right people, right? That they have figure it out later. It's the way out of an organized working class. Right, so there's just there, like you do not have successful social democratic movements that aren't based on that. You just don't have the ground troops to like actually accomplish any of the things that we want to accomplish. Politically, it's not a sufficient condition, but but it is absolutely a necessary condition that you need to turn that around before you can accomplish anything. So I guess. Yeah, I don't know. Come, as you say, coming soon to a town near you is what's Che Guevara said about Vietnam. 1, 2, 3, many Christian smalls.
Good ending as well, Ben.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I'm going to be back with Jen in about an hour for the philosophy segment, and then We're going to be on in the post game with Matt McManus, where we might do a little bit more celebrated about Amazon, and we are also going to make fun of some PragerU, and we're going to do we're going to do various other things. We're going to hear from a congressman about the threat of furries. A lot of good stuff going on in the post game. But before any of that, I am going to be talking to socialist academic Jesse Spafford. As I said, it's a pre-recorded interview we are unlocking tonight, so we'll start that right now.
Be studying here for a degree, but nobody's told me what to do. And he said, and I quote, "I should have thought you would have got in touch with Gilbert Ryle." He said, "I should have thought you would have got in touch with Gilbert Ryle." I was very mystified by this sentence. I'd never heard anybody use so many auxiliary verbs in one sentence like that, right? I mean, I should have thought that you would have got in touch with Gilbert Ryle. And it seemed to me that he was saying that at least one of us had done something bad, right? If not both. So to expiate my sin or his sin or both of our sins, I rang up Gilbert Ryle. And there were a couple of rings. And then what I heard was the following. And I know there are some people here who know from their own experience that this is what I heard. So I rang up. Ryle! That's all. Ryle! Now I assumed he was naming himself, since my name was not Ryle, but Cohen. But that didn't completely solve the problem of what I was supposed to say. I mean, I somehow didn't feel that I should respond by saying, Cohen! So I said, sir, my name is Jerry Cohen, and I was wondering if I could come and see you. And he said, yes, indeed. So I said, when should I come and see you? And he said, pretty well anywhen. He did say that. He said, pretty well, my hand hasn't gone up yet. He said, pretty well anywhen. What about Thursday, crack of dawn? That's 10 o'clock. So I showed up, and he was in person more forceful, more booming, louder, and not intimidating. I mean, you go to the circus and you see a clown shouting, you don't get intimidated. And there was this marvelous way of talking, which was so mannered, and people hypothesized that it was a consequence of the fact that during the Second World War, he had been a major, and he had picked up this mode of speech during that experience. But I think it was so deep he must have had it as a kid, as a baby even. I can't really imagine him whining as a baby. I mean, I can imagine him saying, milk! Burp! Anyway, we had a lot of arguments, and he was a marvelously generous teacher. And on one occasion, he said, and notice my arm hasn't gone up yet, he said, we were talking about sensations, about pleasure and pain. And he said the following. He said, unlike pain, pleasure lacks a distinct bodily location. So I said, but sir, what about sexual pleasure? And he said, there is that, but I was thinking of something more interesting. There's a difference between agony and torture, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Do you have any thoughts about that? So I said, let's see, I can agonize somebody and I can torture somebody. See, I was kind of imitating his way of doing philosophy, where You say things that you can say and that you can't say, and that's it, right? I can agonize someone, and no, I didn't speak like that. I've got the wrong one. I said, I can agonize someone and I can torture someone, and I can both be in agony. I can be in agony, but I can't be in torture. And then he said, and this is when he said, well, this isn't really what he said, but this is of the type of form or sort or kind of thing that he would say. He said, yes, torture and agony are the same kind of thing, but they're not the same type of thing. Because kinds and types, although the same sort of thing, don't belong to the same category. Since categories and classes, while alike in order, differ in nature. Because orders and natures, though similar in character, belong to different dimensions. Now, we now, ladies and gentlemen, we now.
All right. I was watching that just before we started doing this, and I had to share that this is there's quite a bit of that sort of thing on YouTube, but it's all golden. But I am joined by Jesse Spafford. You want to say who you are, Jesse?
Hi, yeah, my name's Jesse. I'm currently a research fellow at Trinity College Dublin, and GTAA Cohen enthusiast. So excited to be here to talk about it with you.
Nice. Yeah. So I found out who you were because somebody told me about this paper that you'd written. It's in the Public Affairs Quarterly from a couple of years ago. It's called "Community as a Socialist Value." So let's want to set this up a little bit. This is an attempt to kind of unpack something, the guy we saw in the clip at the beginning, G.A. Cohen, says in this book, Why Not Socialism? And he enunciates in that book these two kind of principles that he thinks, when he thinks about what a sort of socialist conception of justice would be like, whether you can completely achieve it or not, like what he thinks should be the sort of like North Star of socialist political activity. He talks about two things, one of which is a lot clearer in the text than the other. So do you want to start us off with what those two things are?
Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah. So he's doing this sort of reconstruction, trying to tell people what he thinks the heart of socialism really is, sort of what socialists, if they reflected upon it, would really, care about.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he sort of settles on two principles. Right. One, like you said, one is quite clear and one is less so. So the clearer one is his view about distributive justice, where he sort of presents what's called this luck egalitarian view of distributive justice. So basically, it's this idea where, what justice demands is equality, but not strictly equality. It demands equality, but it's sort of sensitive to people acting in certain sort of negligent and culpable ways, right? So basically, the idea is, we're all we start off entitled to an equal share of, whatever's of value, well-being, advantage, conceivably money, but probably something like well-being. And then the idea is that, you start off with a claim to an equal share, but you can forfeit that claim if you make certain negligent choices. Right. So if you just keep destroying all your belongings, for example, right, then he's going to say, well, we don't have to keep transferring our holdings to you if you keep making these sort of negligent choices.
Yeah. If you enjoy, throwing your TV out of the window, to like recreate the feeling of being, Zeppelin and, the hotel in the 70s or whatever, you don't just get to have new TVs being redistributed to you.
Right. Which, seems sort of, I think, like a reasonable way of moderating it. I mean, in a way, it's sort of his, he sort of says he's captured the most powerful weapon of the anti-egalitarian right by sort of incorporating this notion of responsibility into otherwise strict theories of equality. So rather than delivering these sort of unfortunate results, right? If you're a strict egalitarian, then you've got to say, well, it doesn't matter what people do, they can just be as reckless and, negligent and mean-spirited as they want, and we still have to just keep, transferring our holdings to them and keep things equalized. And so he says, no, if you're responsible for sort of, if you're responsible in certain sorts of ways, then we don't have to keep transferring to you. But if your predicamen's just the result of bad luck, then then you are entitled to live an equally good life as everyone else, right? So, for example, if you're born, with certain disabilities that on the market, mean that you don't bring in as much market income, well, that shouldn't really count against you. You should still be entitled to live as good of a life as everyone else. If you were raised in a household where your parents, didn't have a lot of resources and maybe mistreated you and didn't prepare you to sort of, again, for life in the capitalist market, right? In our current system, you might end up a lot worse off than somebody who grew up in a rich family and got sent to private schools and has all sorts of advantages kind of basically conferred upon them. And he says, so now that's unjust. So that's sort of his luck egalitarian view, right? You shouldn't be penalized for bad luck, just certain sorts of choices.
So he and in that in that book, Why Not Socialism, he refers to this as a kind of equality of opportunity principle, which is, at least rhetorically, like an interesting move, because this is a super common line from right wingers of various kinds. That's like, no, look, we don't care about equality of outcome, but sure, we care about equality of opportunity. And in a way, his point about this first one is, well, if you really, really care about equality of opportunity, then that would apply to all of those things that you just said. All of those non-chosen disadvantages that that people can have, that they have worse outcomes because of something that's outside of their control.
Yeah, and which I think is very effective rhetorically, and he sort of does a nice job building it up, right? He sort of considers things that we intuitively take to be unjust, right? Like, suppose that you live a worse life because you happen to be born in a society that discriminates against you based upon, the social group that you're a member of, right? Something that, pretty much all liberals would agree is unjust, right? If you live a worse life because you happen to be born, in a particular caste or a particular race or a particular gender, then you might think that it seems unjust that you live a worse life in virtue of that. And it sort of seems like, well, why is that unjust? Well, because it seems like that's just luck, right? It's just a matter of chance that you happen to be born, with certain characteristics or in a certain social group, right? Why should you live a worse life than somebody else in virtue of that? That seems unjust. And then he sort of moves from there to say, oh, well, if we think that that's unjust, well, here are some other things that are bad luck, right? It's bad luck to be born into a family that, can't provide you with as much financial support as other families can. It's bad luck to the extent that you believe that people have inborn talents, right? It's bad luck if you just don't happen to have, certain talents or capacities, right? And again, it's like, why should you live a worse life than other people? It seems unfair and unjust to this social setup that denies you, as good of a life as everybody else.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the first principle, and as you say, it's like fairly clear. Like maybe unclear by his own admission, like exactly how we could engineer society to completely fulfill it, right. But at least very clear what the moral principle is. But right. Then there's this other one.
Right. So then there's the community principle, and he says a lot of things about this. He sort of gives a formal definition and says that something like, I don't have the exact definition in front of me, but that we care about having it's important that a society is one where people care about and care for one another, and that there's sort of greater community in societies where that is true. But he also talks about certain ways people approaching each other and dealing with each other with certain motivations, right? So he sort of contrasts having sort of an ethos of community within sort of market ethos, right? So it's a question of whether or not, so he says, to sort of act with community ethos again is to benefit you for your own sake, with sort of the hope that you will benefit me in return, right? Well, a market is, I benefit you just for the sake of my own benefit, right? So there's sort of that component, and then he also gives a lot of examples of where he thinks that community, like of cases where he thinks community has been lost.
So I think one way of kind of intuitively motivating why it's important to him to have this in the picture is that, okay, if you keep throwing your TVs out the window to party like Led Zeppelin, then it seems fair that eventually you stop getting new ones, that this is your choice, and you have to live with the consequence. That doesn't violate any particular egalitarian intuition. But if you make some incredibly foolish life choices, and it is genuinely your fault, that there's no, and in a way that he says most inequality under capitalism is not anyone's fault. But like, hypothetically, I mean, if you do things that are truly and genuinely your fault, you took massively risky bets that you didn't have to take, and etc. And the result of this is like you're starving in the streets, then surely at least part of what motivates socialist politics is the desire that people not be in that position, right? So if that's the case, then we can't use his equality principle to explain why why society should be organized in a way that helps people to stop that from happening. So we need something else.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. Because it does seem like, he sort of later in his life, he started to worry about luck egalitarian being too harsh in this way. And I think, in one other place, he suggests that, well, maybe it's legitimate for, maybe there's still something unfair and unjust about any sort of inequality, but maybe some is legitimate because people made culpable choices. So he sort of tries to walk back this sort of the harshness of luck egalitarianism a little bit, to be like, yeah, maybe even if you make bad choices, there's still maybe something wrong about, you being out on the street while other people are living comfortably. And the community principle seems to be another way of trying to rein in, the sort of inequality that he thinks is morally permissible.
Yeah, good. So I think one way of maybe making making this a little bit more concrete, since he says all these really abstract things, like he says some really abstract things that people who are motivated by this kind of ethos, care about each other, they care about caring about each other, and he kind of says a lot about the emotional sort of aspect of it, but it's, if you're sort of trying to figure out, okay, what are the kinds of things that a principle of community would say are okay and not okay, then it's probably helpful to have some examples. And he gives one of them in the book, at least one in the book, and you give like a few more in your paper that seem to you to be of the same type, or that there are things that he says elsewhere that you think would mean that he would agree that like these are the kinds of things that would count as symptoms of the absence of community.
Yeah. You want me to present these? I've got one.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so maybe I can start with his, since
yeah.
So basically he gives this case that he thinks is sort of paradigmatic loss of community, and it's what I call sort of the bus case, or the transportation case. He says, okay, I am rich and I live an easy life, whereas you are poor. You have to ride the crowded bus every day, whereas I pass you by in my comfortable car. One day, however, I must take the bus because my wife needs the car. I can reasonably complain about that to a fellow car driver, but not to you. I can't say to you, oh, it's awful that I have to take the bus today. There's a lack of community between us of just the sort that naturally obtains between me and the fellow car driver.
Yeah, and that's very you can, like, I know my experience at least is that the first time I read it, I had the sense that I knew what he meant.
Yeah.
And then, I just like, okay, right, got it. And then like subsequent readings, like I started to think, wait a second. I'm actually not at all sure now that I know what he meant, right? Like that there's something about the situation that he's describing there that certainly doesn't sit right with a certain kind of egalitarian intuition, but like what the principle is supposed to be is a lot less clear.
Yeah, and I think that's been sort of this case has been sort of the starting point for various people who try to interpret Cohen, is to sort of say, well, how can we best make sense of this case and like what's going on here, right? And with some interpretations, sort of, I think maybe taking that a little too far and like focusing a lot more on that case than what he says, and some people trying to reconcile,
so
community.
So like Jason Brennan, who wrote this book, Why Not Capitalism, which is sort of an attempt at a like straight like to sort of like it has a kind of libertarian parody of Cohen's argument, and also just a bunch of objections to it, and I think the parody, I think, is very much not compared like to like. Cohen motivates all this at the beginning of his book with a example about a ordinary camping trip of the kind that real people take every day, and Brennan's parody is like this sort of lurid science fiction acid trip of a anarcho-capitalist village of talking animals. But in any case, in that book, Brennan interprets the point about the bus driver as that people's experience of life is very different, so that therefore they can't be, in community with each other or in some way. And he says that Cohen is saying because if you're you have this difference in experience that means that you lack community if you're much richer or much poorer than someone. And I actually think that already is starting to go off the rails, the or much poorer, but then and he seems to interpret this as meaning like, well, you can't, talk to each other about your problems because your experiences would be too different. And then he kind of says, well, anybody, and there are other people who've made, who've glossed it in similar sorts of ways, but he says, well, then if you, but wait a second, what's special about money, right? Like any kind of big life experience, could, like if one person lives in the polyamorous commune and the other one is an Orthodox Jew, then they had very different life experiences. You're saying people shouldn't be allowed to do one or the other of those things. This sounds really authoritarian. So that's like one gloss of what he means here.
Right. Which again, I think, I see sort of how you would arrive at that, right? And a lot of people have, and, mainly his sort of Cohen's libertarian critics, but also some socialists, like this is Richard Miller, who's, that's what he thinks is going on here. Right. And yeah, I see how you could get to that sort of point from this case, right? It's like, what's gone wrong? Like, why can't the bus driver or the bus rider and car driver talk to each other? Yeah, well, they just live such different lives. Like they don't have things in common. But I think that there's a number sort of problems with this interpretation. I mean, sort of right off the bat, it seems like, I think whenever you're giving an interpretation of a philosopher's work, it should be a bit of a red flag if you interpret it in ways where it just has sort of obvious, seriously implausible consequences, right? So, this is, I think, sort of counts against this interpretation when you're like, oh yeah, so it seems like, Cohen's saying that when we don't have much in common, then community is undermined. Oh, but that means that, we can't play different sports or like have, different interests or hobbies or lifestyles. So, right, like, immediately I think that should raise red flags about the interpretation of it. It seems like,
especially because Cohen says many things in many places, including in that book,
right,
that make it clear that he certainly at least wouldn't embrace the consequence. So maybe, maybe you can say that, that he's just being so sloppy here. He had no idea that, that it had this consequence. But at the very least, you should probably start looking first for things that are, consistent with what he says, even elsewhere in the book about how, of course, we live in a society where people make very different kinds of life choices, etc.
Right. And, I guess it's always possible that he sort of is making, a mistake, but it seems like there's sort of other reasons for thinking that that's not the case, right? So another sort of reason I think for thinking that is that in some ways I think that this is just not the sort of right conclusion to draw from the case, right? Because this sort of the way this theory, the diagnosis it gives of this case is that, oh, these people they can't talk to each other. They don't know how to talk to each other. Like they sort of lack this ability to relate to one another, which just seems like it just isn't the case, right? It seems like if the people wanted to, they would have no problem talking about it, right? Say, it says one person complains and they say, oh, such a bummer that I can't drive my car to work. It's so much more comfortable. Like the bus is all hot and sweaty, right? And the other person can say, oh yeah, it really is hot and sweaty in here. Yeah, it's pretty miserable. Like, oh, the car sounds great. Like, what kind of car is it? Oh, have satellite radio. Oh, that sounds great, right? Like, all the time we engage with people who are very different from us, and we do that by asking inquisitive questions, by sort of finding commonalities between their experience and our experience, even when those experiences are quite different, right? And there's just no problem there most of the time, right? So I think that it's just not a great diagnosis of what's gone wrong in this case, right? And so one thing I suggest in the papers, I say, oh, well, maybe the thing that's really gone wrong here is that, right, it seems like the issue isn't that they can't talk to each other. It seems more like an issue of that they might not want to, right? So I sort of say, imagine how this conversation might actually go, right? Imagine you try to actually sort of complain on, you're the car driver and you try to complain on the bus. You're like, oh, wow, this sucks. This is like so much worse than driving my Lexus. Right? Well, what do people on the bus? It's not they're going to be like, oh, weird, like Lexus, what's that, right? Like, oh, shut up about that. Like, oh,
yeah.
You get to drive a Lexus.
Yeah, I mean, it seems even the way that Cohen presents it, like I always did read it, is like the idea is like you wouldn't start complaining about that because it would be like in bad taste.
Right. It's sort of gauche. It's kind of like, yeah, and you can see how it might take you down a bad path. Where,
Right. You kind of play out a little dialogue in the paper. It's like shut up about the Lexus already.
Right.
And
make me right, and then
yeah.
Next thing you know, people are brawling on the bus. So I think that's a second problem. And then I think a third problem is it just does seem to be in tension with what Cohen actually says when he formally sort of states what his community principle is, right? Where he does seem to talk a lot more. He's like, yeah, community is when we care for and about one another. So I think that there's sort of, three big problems with this interpretation, despite its popularity.
I mean, you also mention something that he says elsewhere, which is not necessarily. I mean, there is a little bit of interpretive work here about whether this is, how closely this is related to what he's saying and stuff about community. But he elsewhere, he's contrasting. He's doing kind of what he's doing with the community stuff in Why Not Socialism, contrasting. Let's just say the sort of ethos that he likes, or the kind of reciprocity that he likes, with the sort of reciprocity that people have in market exchanges. And he uses the example of the difference between like being out with your friends and like informally alternating, who buys rounds of beers, with like keeping the receipts and making sure you make sure that the other person has spent to the cent, exactly as much as you have.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because that sort of appears in basically like the earlier draft, like the first draft of Why Not Socialism, and then it doesn't appear in the actual book. So I'd be curious to know why you took it out. But to me, it seems like a good case, right? I feel like this is often something that you'll experience. There's often that one person who wants to, keep down to the penny sort of tabulations of how much you owe them, and and it does so often seem like, well, there's sort of a similar. Seems like there's a similar sort of problem going on there. So I'm sort of like a good theory of community should be one that kind of captures both of these, can explain both of these cases, right? And it seems like sort of the Brennan interpretation can't really make sense of what's gone wrong in this sort of, I think Cohen calls it the fine-tuning case, right? Being really meticulous about just how much we owe each other.
I think that's like, and like what's like the idea that there's something wrong with that fine tuning is super intuitive, and also that would be, that like this is at least a difference between how we approach market exchanges and how we approach other things in our lives, right? It's not like, with sort of informally helping people that you care about. It's not like there's no expectation of reciprocity. If you helped your friend move a couch once, and and then like you're moving, and he's like, oh no, I don't feel like it. Like you get pissed off about that, but that seems to be a very different thing from the kind of exchange where you'd like be really paying a lot of attention to exactly how much you were giving or exactly how much you were receiving.
Yeah, definitely. Right, and I think that there's sort of a similar, kind of potential for conflict too in this case. That's something that I talk about in the paper. I have sort of another case where I was watching the TV show New Girl, and they've sort of a funny sort of, exaggeration of the kind of tension where, these two friends, and they get into this big fight as they start to just call in all their debts to one another. And they're like, oh yeah, well, you bought me you got me to buy you that box turtle. It's like, oh, well, you come to my bar and like drink for free all the time. And like, it creates this very like acrimonious relationship that almost ends the friendship. So it does seem like there's this sort of, common thread of tension. That is very sort of not what you'd like to see among a group of people who are getting along well.
So that all makes sense. And I mean, separate it out a little bit as you do in the paper, the question of exactly what Cohen has in mind from like the role that it's playing in his argument. Because just focusing on that second one, right? Like if you sort of think that the big structure of this like makes sense, that you have the kind of equality that you care about is maybe that people shouldn't have less than others because of factors outside their control. Makes sense. But that said, clearly the package of moral intuitions driving all of this would be like crazily violated if we let people like just really suffer, and because of even when that wasn't the case, that it's like that nobody's somebody's somebody is starving to death in the streets, and you say, oh, well, you made your bed, right? Like you sleep on it. So like this, if community is supposed to play the role of doing the second thing, like one way of interpreting this that a lot of the stuff that Cohen says does suggest is has to do with people's like the kind of affective attitudes that people have, like like how much you personally how much various individuals care about various other individuals. And one thing that is a little bit awkward about that is that it seems like if the point of all of this, right, if you're imagining maybe I mean there might be, as I think you'd be sympathetic to, like a anarchist way of unpacking all of this, but just for the sake of simplicity, right? Like assuming we're thinking about like these are the principles that should guide our evaluation of policies implemented by governments, that it sort of feels like the wrong category, right? I mean, like is that really is that really the way that we evaluate policies, like by like what people's like what people's emotional attitudes are?
Yeah, I think that is a problem. And at the sort of, I give slightly different gloss in paper. So here's a worry that you might have is that one thing you might want out of this is you might want sort of Cohen's book to justify socialist economic systems, right? But the problem is you might think that people not caring about each other adequately is sort of a cause, sort of, in a way, market systems sort of reflect a lack of caring rather than the other way around, right? So you might think that these sort of attitudes sort of are prior, and then our social systems reflect the attitudes, and that just changing the social system, right? You might implement, say like a basic income, or, a much broader welfare state, or socialize the means of production, whatever your sort of preferred socialist scheme is. And you might think, well, will this really change people's attitudes? Will this make people care about each other in the way that socialists might want, that Cohen might want? And it seems like, I mean, the answer might be yes, right? It might turn out that if we sort of have a more sort of robust set of workplace democracy, work co-op, there's a lot more co-ops, and there's more welfare state, then that might start to change our attitudes about people. We might start to, care about other people more because our economic system promotes that. I think that's possible, but it's a little contingent, right? It might just not turn out to be the case at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's totally implausible that it might have that effect. I think that I think that there is maybe some reason to think that. I mean, it's a little bit speculative, as you say. It's an empirical question, but you could certainly think that, like, okay, one reason why like societies tend to to form narratives about impoverished underclasses, being lazy and racially inferior, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is because like it makes it a little easier to sleep at night, like seeing how people in that class are living. And so maybe if you equalize circumstances, a lot of that goes away. Although how much it would go away is another question. It also just seems like, okay, even there, the relationship, like even if we assume that's true, the relationship still doesn't seem quite right, because now it seems like, okay, maybe this is like a happy side effect of changing the system, right? But that doesn't. It seems a little strange to say that this is, like if we're saying, like if you're saying the system is bad because it hasn't had this effect, that seems a little strange. Like we have, like, if hypothetically we equalize the economic circumstances, but people don't actually start caring about each other more, then like, okay, so we should say this is like defective from like a socialist perspective. That seems odd.
Right. Or even worse, suppose that it breeds sort of resentment,
Right.
for whatever reason, right? Would that comes the effect? I don't know, maybe so, but it isn't fully clear that it will do kind of justificatory work that, I think a lot of socialists will want and that Cohen might want. Though that said, I think that, Cohen sort of later in his career starts to take a more, kind of a more bottom-up view of, what the point of philosophy is and like what he wants from, what sort of a socialist revolution might look like. And he starts to think that maybe it starts to look more like a moral revolution, right? That, that's kind of what would usher in socialism rather than, sort of top-down restructuring of, the sort of way that the means of production are owned or, something along those lines. It actually is just a mass sort of change in attitude and opinion and behavior by individuals. In which case, then you might think this problem dissolves a little bit, right? Then you might think, well, yeah, what matters is whether or not we care about each other, and whether or not we care about each other kind of goes hand in hand with how we treat each other when it comes to producing, goods. And so we might think that, the sort of socialist ethos does require us to care about one another and care for one another. And we sort of, when we embody that's sort of the socialist revolution happening at a sort of micro scale.
Yeah, and okay, so I mean, this gets a lot more niche now, but I mean, like, it's certainly then you have a reason to look for a different account of what this communitary value is. Other than that, if A, you like the basic structure of Cohen's argument, why not socialism?
Right.
But B, you don't really buy any of that stuff that you just said, right? Like, like if you're somebody like me who basically thinks that now, he was kind of like right the first time with like the defense of like a materialist theory of history that would tell you that like you're not, like, you shouldn't really expect any of that to happen,
Right.
then if you still want to salvage this argument of why not socialism, you want some alternative, less psychological, account of what this other value is.
Right. And that's sort of what I suggest in my paper. So that I kind of then try to step in and give my own sort of theory of community that can make sense of Cohen's cases and also sort of avoid some of these problems. So I don't know if I can.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So basically, I suggest that, maybe the way to think about community, and again, I don't want to say that I'm sort of giving the right interpretation. I think I'm going a bit beyond Cohen here. Like, I do think that people who think that I do think that Cohen sort of thinks of community as terms of caring for each other, about one another. I think that's basically right as far as sort of exegesis goes. But I do think that there sort of is need for a different account that maybe sort of avoids some of the problems of that account and has certain other advantages. So basically what I suggest is I think that the way we should think about community is we should think about it in terms of sort of people's dispositions to assist each other and, to not sort of cause each other problems. Right. So that's the sort of very loose idea, is that you might think that there's a real moral improvement in a world where sort of people are, just disposed to help each other when we're in need, to, give each other gifts, to not sort of antagonize each other, to not, just, harm people in various casual ways, sort of in a way, just strictly from a utilitarian kind of.
Oh no, I lost you for a second. Uh-oh. I'll try to take you out and take you back in. All right. Yep, you're back. You're back. So, the last thing I heard was, in a way, from a strictly utilitarian.
Oh yeah, from a strictly utilitarian perspective, right? You might think that this is a real sort of moral advantage or moral improvement, right? So that's kind of the rough. And there's all sorts of complications about it, how exactly like you would quantify this, and I kind of go on about this probably in a little too much length in the paper, but right, you kind of get this. I think it's fairly clear what the rough intuitive idea is that it's better when people, in more situations are prone to help people to greater degrees. And
Yeah, and this is something that you could sort of translate to the level of institutions, right? That they say like the design of an institution, or maybe the policies that are carried out by that institution, are like tend I don't know, tend to help people and not hurt them more, or tend to be reflective of a disposition to do that, or something like that.
right. And which, in retrospect, I feel like I made this point a little bit more sort of empirical than I wanted to, right? Because, you might think, well, that's an open question, and what does the social science say? But one thing that I sort of do bring up in the papers, I say, well, if what we care about is people's dispositions to help and harm each other, then it sort of seems like a defect of a social system is one where it basically makes helping people in this way irrational. Right? From if say you're just even sort of modestly prudentially sort of concerned about yourself, right? Then you might think that, yeah, if a social system sort of makes it irrational to help other people, then that's a defect of the social system. Right. So, I give sort of a few examples of this, but basically the idea is that you might think that, right, suppose that you and I are in some sort of zero-sum situation, right? We're on a desert island. There's only enough food for one of us, right? And, and then all of a sudden, you fall over and hurt your leg.
Right.
It seems like, well, should I help you from a prudential standpoint, right? It seems like, well, given the circumstances, probably not, right? It seems like it's rational from sort of self-interested perspective to not help you, because helping you ultimately will just enable you to work against my interests and goals, right? And so it seems like that's sort of a bad social system, right? And so even then I'm like, well, maybe as a contingent matter, I might just be sort of, such a nice person that I just can't help myself and rush over to help you. But you still might think it's defective just because, if for the social system to run well and smoothly, and not have people sort of constantly, either attacking each other or not helping each other, if that sort of requires them being irrational in some sense, right, then you might think that that's a defect of the social system.
Yeah, right. And this is, and the thing that's particularly good about this is that this is like lines up with sort of usual, like the things that socialists usually focus on as defects of capitalism, and say, well, it's not just that like contingently, like rich people happen to be jerks. It's that the design of the economic system is such that capitalists have interests that are counterposed to workers, and so you're going to predictably get people acting on those interests.
Right. So I that's sort of the key thought, right? Is that capitalism and I sort of focus on markets in particular, right? And I say, they actually sort of pit our interests against each other in just this way, in a number of ways, right? So, for example, most obviously, there's just market competition, right? Sort of one of the key things that you need for a market to work, in some sense, is you need different competing buyers and sellers who are basically trying to undercut each other and sort of trying to run each other out of business, right? So the thought is that if you start a firm and then I start a rival firm, we're working against each other in a very sort of concrete way, right? If I kind of get my way, if I'm maximally successful, I will just run you out of business and sort of deprive you of a livelihood, right? So then,
and in fact, that's how, like, that's not even just like that's not like a prediction about what's going to arise from market mechanisms, or an observation of what does arise. That's how it's supposed to work. Like all of the benefits of market system are supposed to come precisely from the fact that people are competing for each other, with each other for market share.
Right, exactly. But then it sort of raised the question. I'm like, well, then it seems like that creates the sort of structure where it starts to look like it's not super rational from a self-interested standpoint to say, provide you with assistance, right? If you've got your little restaurant on the corner and I open up my rival restaurant, and then, I see you walking down the street and you fall into the gutter and you're about to get hit by a bus, like, I could pull you out, but in some sense doing that, I know is like, you're trying to run me out of business and basically ruin my life in some sense.
Right.
And it seems like then, is it really rational for me to pull you out? Right? Maybe I will, because I'm just happen to be psychologically disposed that way. But it sort of seems like if I were more reflective, I might not. Maybe, you might even go so far as to say I shouldn't from that sort of self-interested standpoint. And I think that it's a defect of a social system if that's what it renders sort of rational. Right. So that's one example, but there's a bunch of other ways that markets sort of pit us against each other. Right. So also I think it pits you against each other in just the buying selling relationship. Right. You go to the car dealership, right? They're in some sense trying to like extract as much money from you as they can. Right. They, if they could sort of really in some sense, if they had their way, and could sort of trick you into just signing over all of your assets to them in exchange for a total junker car, right? They would maybe, probably do that. I mean, depending how ruthless they were, but like that would be the perfect win for them. Right. And so granted, you're sort of pushing back and forth more at the margins, but they're trying to take as much from you as possible. You're trying to deny them as much as possible. Right. Again, you're in the same sort of zero sum type situation that seems to, maybe render it irrational to help them in other contexts. And then finally, I want to say that, like, just, one sort of feature of markets is private ownership of, goods and resources, right? And you might think that in that sort of environment, right, you might see us as sort of being situated where we're struggling over who controls, big shares of resources, right? So, when I accumulate a bunch of wealth, right, in some sense, I'm hoarding that and trying to keep everybody else from, accessing my wealth, right? And doing so, like, there's a direct zero-sum relationship there, right? The more money that I accumulate for myself, the more sort of goods and resources and services that I consume, the less there is for everyone else. So insofar as I'm trying to maximize that, I'm directly working against their interests. So again, you sort of have us pitted against each other in this way that seems to render, cooperation and assistance and, beneficence irrational. Right. And it seems like that's a real defect of a social system. And then, so in the paper, I do kind of think, I suggest contingently that maybe that these sort of social systems do, in fact, empirically, change people's dispositions and give people, a disposition that make them less likely to sort of aid each other and promote each other's welfare and more likely to diminish each other's welfare. But that, that's sort of a contingent matter. I'm not sure. You'd have to sort of check the social science. But I also do sort of suspect that, and this is sort of maybe a wackier view of mine, but I do kind of think that people move toward what is sort of reasonable, like, slowly over time. It's kind of funny. This is like sort of I don't know, Michael Humer's got a view about this, where he sort of thinks that people that have been liberalizing over time steadily, and he sort of comes, cites all these statistics about how people have been liberalizing, and his sort of theory is like, and there's a reason people are liberalizing over time, and that's because liberalism is sort of the correct moral theory, and that as people sort of become more sophisticated and education improves, people have time to discuss and debate, they actually sort of converge on the correct moral theory. And I sort of think, it's kind of a wacky view, but I'm in many ways sympathetic to this. And I sort of think the same thing could be true of social systems, right? Even if contingently it turns out that markets don't sort of, change our dispositions in this way, I do suspect that if what's rational is to sort of have the disposition where you're not willing to help other people, not help your rivals, and sort of cause them harm when given the opportunity, then I do think that over time people will start to converge on that, and sort of their dispositions will change over time as, they sort of become more sophisticated in terms of like, thinking about these things. So that's sort of the way I would put things now. In the paper, I'm a little bit more empirical, but at the very least, I do think that it seems like a defect of the social structure if just what is rational is to not help people and to harm people.
Yeah. So if nothing else, like, even if contingently, it turned out that people were super duper irrationally benevolent, which obviously we know in a very great many cases is not true. I don't think you need to do a deep dive into social science to know that. But even if that were true, then that like most people most of the time, resisted incentives, that it does still seem like, at least all else being equal, it's a good making feature of a social system if it doesn't incentivize people to want to harm each other.
Right. And I do think that just sort of anecdotally, you can still make sense of a lot of sort of latent conflict by, just by appealing to, this sort of, so that's what I think is going on in the bus case, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the reason? Why is it that, the rich car driver can't complain? Well, because it seems like people might get sort of angry and, potentially fights will break out. And in some sense, I think it reflects, because once you start talking about it, right? Once you start bringing up wealth differences, that kind of sheds light on this sort of zero-sum structural sort of defect of capitalist systems, right? You start to sort of be like, oh yeah, I hadn't really thought about it, but this guy standing next to me on the bus, right, supporting all this wealth, right? Like, I'm living this hard life that I could live much more comfortably if this person, didn't insist on like driving a Lexus around. Like they've sort of prioritized their comfort over mine. They sort of, well, in some sense, enforce this by appealing to the armed agents of the state, right? They sort of, demand that their private property is enforced by the police, and that sort of leaves me worse off as a result. So why should I be nice to this person when they're actively, sort of drawing upon the coercive violence of the state to leave me worse off than them?
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, it seems like kind of the thought in the bus example is that I would kind of be rubbing their face as the Lexus driver in the fact that that like they're way worse off than me,
right?
And I could change that if I wanted to, but I don't.
Right, exactly. And that sort of, I think, reflects that, your interests are zero sum, and the Lexus driver is leaning into that, right? They're sort of, making the most of that at your expense. And it's sort of like, yeah, why should I be nice to this person? If, why should I help this person if they, are going to sort of, if that's their attitude and that's their approach to me? Right. And that seems like a real defect of a social system if that's the sort of attitude it cultivates. And it does, and like I said, I think cases like that suggest that it does cultivate the attitude, because I think it does explanatory work, right? It's like, that's why we have to kind of be careful in these situations. Like, that's why, if you're sort of a rich person, you don't bring it up in any context.
Yeah, and sometimes I think in fact, very often, right? I mean, anecdotally, right? You sort of go out of your way to not bring it up, right? If certain questions about money come up that like you and I might discuss freely, because like there's no reason not to,
right?
Like I don't know. I mean, an anecdotal example I think of from a person from a very wealthy family that I knew in graduate school. Like the first time I was over at his place, I said, "Wow, this is great. What do you pay in rent for this?" Which, like, just one graduate student speaking to another would be like a super normal question,
right?
That would be answered right away, and like it wouldn't be awkward at all. And they sort of like did this like foot shuffly change of subject thing,
I got a great deal on it. It was really lucky thing. Yeah,
because you don't want to just say like, "Oh yeah, my parents paid for this. It was super expensive," like that's because you'd be sort of even in that like small context, right? I mean, like in some ways it's a less dramatic thing than like I have to ride the crowded bus every day versus I'm driving by in a Lexus. It's just, but even in that context, there's this kind of understandable instinct to not want to call attention to the disparity.
Right. Or one that's sort of an example I sort of briefly bring up in the paper is sort of the quip about people who when you ask people who have gone to Harvard and you say, where do you go to college? It's like,
Boston.
Oh, in Boston. Right. And it's like, oh, it's sort of funny, right? It's like, oh, well, why are people so evasive about this?
Right.
I think, this theory can kind of explain that, right? It's like, oh, well, in a world where educational opportunities are so sort of zero sum and everyone's kind of competing, trying to like, get the few coveted spots and get everybody else out and then leverage their sort of educational credentials into, these high paying jobs that only a few people get and other people don't. It's a little awkward to sort of admit that that you're sort of winning this game, right? You're sort of playing this, engaged in this contest and winning. And I think that's, people don't want to bring that up. They don't want to kind of keep it taboo. So I think you can sort of explain all sorts of little weird taboos like that by appealing to this general theory of community.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's even one that you could, like, if you think that something like this is the sort of correct, precise way to put it, right? Like something closer to Cohen's way of putting it could still make sense as a sort of like informal shorthand popularization, like the allowing allowing this level of suffering reflects a kind of callous, collective callousness, towards people, towards people who are at the bottom, whatever, like that. Like everybody would kind of know what you meant in a rough, intuitive way, and then you could say, well, but the sort of precise way to think about exactly what this means is less about what emotions you're feeling, than it is about actual propensity to help people out or institute policies that will help people out or whatever, because this is something that is sort of like in Why Not Socialism is kind of fudged a little bit, because he quotes this this like old socialist song that he'd grown up singing at like Canadian Communist Party youth camps or whatever, and it's something about like if all men were brothers, and he sort of like admits in passing, okay, obviously not literally, right? Like I'm not gonna, clearly we couldn't literally have a society where everybody had the same emotional attitude towards each other that they have even to friends, much less siblings, right? Like part of what maybe it's even like definitional to friendship or constitutive of it that like that it's exclusive, that like I don't, that like part of what it means that you're my friend or whatever is that I don't feel, that like I don't feel towards any random person that that I meet on the street, like on the street exactly how I feel towards you. But he says, but still there's like a version of something like this that we can't have or something like that. And certainly something where you're talking less about how you feel about it emotionally and more about like what the results of that are going to be in terms of individual behavior or collective decision making within some institution or something like that.
Yeah.
Might make that distinction a lot cleaner.
Right. So, and then these things could go hand in hand, right? Like, so maybe I sort of speculate in the paper a little bit that, maybe one of the sort of, if you're disposed to help people, right, then you might also feel a sort of effective way toward them. You might feel some sort of fellow feeling, positive attitude. And often, I think libertarians are often critical of this sort of ethos because they're kind of like, well, who cares? Why, does it matter that you sort of, feel warm feelings toward, just any random stranger in the street? But actually, I kind of do think that there's something maybe morally theory, but it does seem like there's maybe some morally better about, having this sort of fellow feeling. Like if you just think about, imagine just going through your day, right, where, you go to the grocery store, you buy some food, and you're like, great, thanks. And you sort of walk out, right? First be like, oh, like, hey, like, so good to see you. Like, thanks for getting, thanks for doing this. Like, oh yeah, I appreciate, how are you doing? Like, nice to see you, right? It seems like those sorts of relations, I feel like it's nice. I don't know. I don't have a developed theory about this, but I'm open to the idea that there's something,
Yeah, that this could be like a, even if you don't think, like, it might be analytically useful to separate whether the economic institutions / policies are what they should be,
right,
from whether they're accompanied by these kinds of attitudes, for all the reasons we were talking about earlier. But that said, it would that's totally compatible with saying that it's like it's a desirable feature of like economic arrangements that like they lead to they lead to this, like that they help generate that kind of like more affective like kind of feeling of community that like we all, I mean, I think we all normally think that there's something like a little bit regrettable about it if people are like going around in like a crowded city or whatever, sort of like casually resenting each other. And, you know, and we think that there's like something better about it if that's not the case.
Right. Yeah. That's a nice way of putting it.
Well, thank you. This was great.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah. This was fun. And I appreciate you having me on to talk about this.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And I should say, people want to read the paper or a bunch of other papers on related topics. That's jessespafford.com. So yeah, have to talk again sometime.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. So that was Jesse Spafford. We have the link. The link to that paper, I believe, is in the description for this episode. And you should check that out. You should also check out a conversation that I had with Jesse yesterday on the Call-In Show about a different paper, actually a book chapter that he wrote that was criticizing Michael Huemer, who's a libertarian who I actually had debate with last year about whether taxation is theft. Meanwhile, I want, before Jen comes on for the philosophy segment, want to just highlight a couple things. So one of them is an article, forgot to mention earlier, came out a few days ago in the Daily Beast. It's called What the Left Keeps Getting Wrong About Free Speech. And it's actually, I think there's a pretty good tie-in between this article and what I'm arguing in there, and what and the subject that we were talking about for the first half hour of today's episode, because I think it just came out in The Intercept. There's an article by Ken Clipperstein, or at least I saw him post it. Let me make sure this is actually him. But basically about how Amazon just put out this little chat app for workers at its warehouses, where one of the things that they do in the app is they actually ban people from using words like union or working conditions, or I believe slave labor is one of the terms that's banned in the Amazon worker chat app. Which, is maybe a small but telling example about why the left should take free speech seriously, and why we should be the last ones to sort of minimize the importance of it, or make jokes about frozen peaches, or especially we should be the last ones to say, oh, it only counts as a free speech issue if it's the government, not a private corporation, because, of course, a absurd amount of the flow of information in our late capitalist hellscape is controlled by private corporations. And so if you say, oh, they can do whatever they wanted, that's not a free speech issue. That's, rhetorically probably not the best move for the left to make. Okay, so I also have another article that's out of the Daily Beast, actually today, but I'm not sure. So I think we have a graphic of that, but we don't have it uploaded yet. So we're going to talk about that in the post game with Matt McManus. But basically, it is about right-wing populism and why that is a con. But right now.
What up, homies?
Yes, best Gentrance in a while. So
I hear you're already in here plugging stuff.
Yeah. Well, I've been plugging away while I've been waiting.
Waiting?
Yeah.
Nobody told me it was time for me.
Yeah. Okay. Last couple minutes, but anyway. So what I thought we'd do.
Hi, Jay Andrew.
Yeah, exactly. And that is a beautiful example if they actually did ban the word plantation. But in any case, so we thought we'd do something a little bit different for the philosophy segment tonight. And
just plug more of your stuff.
Yeah, we're gonna plug,
actually what we're doing.
We're gonna plug even more of it. There's gonna be so much plugging. It's just madness. All right. So I thought we'd talk just as a little treat. We have not really pushed this book that much because academic publishing being what it is not cheap. And honestly, I've been telling anybody who wants to read it to just like get your library to order a copy. But I have a new book that just came out a couple of weeks ago. One that has absolutely nothing to do with politics.
It would make a great movie, though.
It would not make a great movie. It is called Logic Without Gaps or Gluts, How to Solve the Paradoxes Without Sacrificing Classical Logic. And this is basically the core argument for my doctoral dissertation, which was the original idea when I was approached about writing this book it's for the Synthesa Library Series at Springer. And the original idea was, do you want to adapt your dissertation? And at that point, I was like, I wrote that, whatever it was at that point, 3 years ago. I could do way better now. So I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to just write it from scratch. I think I could present a way better version of the argument now. So I did, and it ended up taking, a few years.
You've been working on this like our whole marriage.
Almost. Not quite, but almost. Feels like it. I think we've been married for about like a year and change when I got the original offer about whether I wanted to write the book. And, to be fair, I guess it was like almost 2 years by the time I actually started writing it. But the vast majority of our marriage, I was working on this book in the background.
Well, okay, so J. Andrew, Ben's mom and I have decided that when it comes to the casting, she wants to play not A, and I gave her a choice because, seniority. So she's going to play not A, and I'm going to play A.
That's a joke you'll get by the end of the segment. So
she wanted to be the villain, so we're gonna run with that.
Yeah, so the
gaps and gluts in the secondary.
Yeah,
it's a Cowboys joke.
So I started writing in summer of 2016. I actually finished writing the first draft in the summer of 2018. Actually, before Doug Lane approached me with the idea for Give Them an Argument, the book, and I started writing that. And so I basically wrote Give Them an Argument right after I'd finished writing this. I already had good writing habits built up, so I could kind of plow through that. And then like fall of 2018, I got the comments from the reviewer with the revisions they wanted. And then at that point, we were getting into when I was doing videos for Zero Books, and I started doing a segment on the Michael Brooks Show, and I was going nuts promoting what turned out to be the first book in order of publication, and et cetera, and just kind of
here's the guy who really knows how to write.
Right.
I know you don't get it, but
all right, fair enough.
Again, don't worry about it.
Yeah. So anyway, between all of those things, actually finishing the revisions took me like another, it was like 3 years and something. So it was not fast because there were so many other things. I mean, to be fair, I'd written a couple other books and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, was not slacking, but was not doing that. So finally finished. And this book is finally out. Let's get it one more time. Get the it is finally out there in the world. Logic Without Gaps or Gluts: How to Solve Paradox Without Sacrificing Classical Logic. So I would be shocked if as many as 1,000 people read it, but I thought
1,000.
Well, actually, apparently there are already a couple hundred, so it was way more than I was predicting.
Oh, I thought you were predicting like 10.
I was half jokingly predicted like 10, but
seriously predicting 25.
But apparently it's been like a couple hundred or something. But anyway,
wow, that's very impressive.
But I hope most of those are for libraries because it's not cheap. But anyway, so I thought it'd be fun to do something a little bit different for the philosophy segment. And explain a little bit, at least in a rough sense, what the book is
Very
about.
rough.
So, yeah, there we go. There we go. Do you know that one?
Am I supposed to?
So it's the New York Times did an article about Ben Shapiro once where they called him the cool kids philosopher,
Oh.
which should be a source of deep embarrassment to everybody who's involved in that article. But anyway,
You're much cooler.
well, that is not a high bar. So
He talks faster though.
he does talk faster. That is undeniable. He's got that going. And you know, and he'd probably also, you know, be better at slipping out of a tight space, you know, where you had to like duck down really far to, you know, to sneak out. So, you know, he's got a few other talents, but so the book, what it's basically about, which is what my dissertation was about, is philosophy of logic, and specifically it has to do with the liar paradox, which involves sentences like this one. For anybody listening later on the podcast, this says this sentence is false. And on the face of it, there's a problem with this. And one way of seeing the problem is, at least given this principle called the T schema, which says that A and A could just be any statement, right? A is true if and only if it's true. A, if and only if it's true that A. In other words, you could both go from A to it's true that A. You can go, for example, from snow is white to it's true that snow is white. And then you could also go the other way around, from it's true that snow is white to snow is white. So at least given that principle, which has got to be one of the most mind-numbing sort of like feels too obvious to be worth spelling out things ever. But,
I know my mind is numb right now.
but at least given that, if you think about the sentence is false. It presents this apparent conflict between two really, really basic principles of logic. That, you know, if you ever took a logic class and you had to do truth tables where you put little T's and F's under things to represent all the possible combinations of
So much fun.
Whether one part can be true or one part can be false. Yeah, Jen actually loves teaching logic. She actually seriously does, and she's very good at it. But so one really basic principle is something called the law of excluded middle. Jen, what's the law of excluded middle?
Either A or not A.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. So, if I say something like it'll rain tomorrow, and let's say you haven't looked at a weather report, you have no idea whether I said whether what I said is true or false. You have no idea whether it'll rain tomorrow. You can still be 100% certain that it either will or will not rain tomorrow. That's the law of excluded middle.
Some things are and some things are not.
Yeah, which is funny because that is a old Louis C.K. bit.
He's canceled now. We can't say that anymore.
Well, I think he might be slightly.
Is he uncanceled?
He might be slightly uncanceled. He actually he actually won a Grammy the other night. So, yep, there we go. Andy is on the ball. But yes, indeed, Louis C.K. won a Grammy for his comedy album. Came out last year. He didn't show up to collect it, but he did win it. So he might be on the road to uncancellation. For my thoughts on this, by the way, see canceling comedians. Long words.
Wow.
Critique of the contemporary left.
Man, Jake is on fire.
He really is. So in any case, but yeah, that's an old Louis C.K. bit. He's talking about explaining something to his daughter who's like 3 or something in the story. And she keeps saying, why? Why? And he's like, well, because of this. But why? And then finally he's like, because some things are and some things are not, which is just the law of excluded middle. And then
If we had kids, that would be my first answer to everything.
And then the other one is the law of non-contradiction, which is
Not A and not A.
Yeah.
These parentheses are very important.
Yes,
here.
it is not the case both that A and not A, right? So for any random statement, law of excluded middle says either that statement or its negation will be true. That's either A or not A. Law of non-contradiction says, but not both. All right.
That
so
seems pretty simple.
it does seem pretty simple.
All right, class over.
But think about the sentence again.
Oh.
This sentence is false.
Ooh.
Yeah. Yikes. What are we going to do there? So-
Yikes. I haven't heard anybody say yikes in a long time.
Yeah, well, yikes. So, because if that sentence is true, then it's false. And if it's false, it's not true. So, if it's true, it's both true and not true, which would violate the law of non-contradiction.
Oh, no.
So, it can't be true. But
You can
according
see
to,
what a pot boiler this is going to be.
according to the law of excluded middle, the options are true and not true. So we just said if it's true, it's both, which would violate excluded middle. So which would violate non-contradiction. According to excluded middle, the only other option is it's not true. But if it's not true, well, then it's false. And if it's false, it's true. So if it's not true, it's both true and not true.
Cats and dogs living together in harmony.
Exactly. We got that here, but we know
We
the
do.
true contradiction. So, so you might say, okay, all right, I see what's going on here. So the problem is that that really she didn't say logic is mind numbing. I think she said philosophy of logic is mind numbing.
I said my mind is a currently no.
That's true. She didn't even say what I said. She just said that her mind was currently numb. No, I mean, I have seen her go through proofs on the board, help with both the truth tables, sit at the Barnes & Noble cafe by, the Rutgers philosophy department all day and all night helping students,
Yeah.
She really gave it her all. She is a good logic teacher. But
Oh.
so you might say, okay, I know what's going on here. So we said that if it's true, that it's false, and therefore not true, and therefore both. And if it's not true, that means it's false, and therefore it's true because what it says is that it's false, and therefore it's both true and not true. We've got a contradiction again.
How do you keep all this straight in your head, or are you just talking about true and not true and false enough, or do you know what you're saying at any given time, or is this just one of these he knows that I know that he knows that I know, and you can't really grasp it in your head as you're going along?
I could probably say the same thing about a lot of Cowboys trivia that you know. So either way, right? If it's true, we've got a contradiction. If it's false, we've got a contradiction, it looks like. So you might say, aha, I know the answer here.
Aha!
Exactly. One more time.
Aha!
Yeah, like that. Like what she just did. So you might say, okay, now I got it. It must be that there's a third option, that there's true, false, and something else. So there's some third truth value besides true and false, and that'll help me solve this.
You can find that on the internet in memes where kids are doing true false exams, and they write a word that can both be read as true and false. Y'all should look that up. I don't think Jake has that at the ready.
No, that might take him 10 or 20 seconds to come up with. Yeah. Well, here's the problem, though, that if you say, well, it's not true or false, it's something else, it's trolls, and that'll help us out. That that there's a third option, and once we realize there's the third option, we'll get around the paradox. But oh no, you can do what's called a revenge paradox, which is a fun combination of words. I remember going to
This is where the movie gets good.
I remember going to this conference in Scotland in 2012, a few months before we started dating.
And he didn't take me with him.
Yes, because we weren't dating yet.
Yeah. And I started to date you anyway, even though you didn't take me with you.
And there's this grad student at the time in Glasgow, and so he had this really thick Glaswegian accent. I'm not going to try to imitate, but because he was talking about revenge paradox, and since there's a point where who's talking about his research, is like, I primarily work on revenge. That was fantastic. But A revenge paradox just means a new version of the paradox that's reformulated to show why some solution doesn't work. So, for example, if you say, aha, I've solved it, it's not true or false, it's this third thing, and that it being that third thing, it's neither true nor false, that'll show how we can get around this. Then, what about this sentence? This one says, this sentence is either false or neither true nor false. Well, if it's true, it's either both true and false contradiction, or both true and neither true nor false contradiction. If it's false, then it's both false and true contradiction. If it's neither, then it's both true and neither true nor false, which is a contradiction. So we have not, in fact, gone around anything. And
you know what is sad? Is
what's
that sentence would make more sense to me if it was written in logical notation than in English.
All right. That's good. So there are different things that, like, at this point, some people start to say, well, maybe we just need to rethink everything, start over logic from scratch to,
Baby with the bathwater.
Exactly, to deal with this. So, like Hartree Field, who was actually on my dissertation committee, but I really disagree with about this, says, well, maybe we should reject classical logic in favor of apparent-complete logic, which says that sometimes the LEM fails. So
Who among us is perfect?
You don't need to say that that every statement is either true or not true, and then you get some really weird results from that. And then an even more extreme one comes from Graham Priest, who is a really important philosopher of logic, although he has this view that is, I think most people who do other kinds of philosophy regard as being pretty odd. So he has a paraconsistent solution. I remember a friend of mine in grad school once saying paraconsistent sounded like a combination of Math and the Ghostbusters, as paraconsistent, but which says that there can be exceptions to the LNC. Liar sentences really are just both true and false, which gets you some really weird results if you start to think about that. Like if I say that here, if I have those headphones, it's in one hand or another.
I guess left.
It's not in this one. They say, okay, it must be in the other one, right?
Yes.
But wait, the reasoning we just used there was either A or B, not A, therefore B.
This is called the disjunctive syllogism, boys and girls.
But wait, if contradictions can be true, then it could be true that A or B, and it could be true that not A, without it being true that B, because A could be both true and not true, and B could just be not true. So if everything I just said was true, A would be true, which would mean that A or B was true. And
he knows that I know that he knows.
And not A would be true.
Yes, that's it.
He is really on the ball tonight.
He really is.
So A or B would be true, not A would be true, but B would not be true.
Ooh.
So, but yet, come on, disjunctive syllogism is obviously a good reasoning form.
Even dogs can use disjunctive syllogism. We don't need to go into that big story.
Yeah.
All of these people have probably heard you tell it before, so it's
all right.
okay.
Well, next philosophy segment we'll do the even dogs use disjunctive syllogism, but we will probably
Lucy will be a guest.
we
can show her using disjunctive syllogism.
Well,
it's okay, I got a headache too.
We will cut it off there for.
We will.
Well.
Oh no!
To find out what the actual solution is,
read that book.
Read the book. So, as indicated in the title, I actually do think there's a way of explaining what's going on here without throwing out, the baby with the bathwater and rejecting classical logic. That you can and should sort of retain the assumption that law of excluded middle is true, law of non-contradiction is true, T-schema is true, it's all true. But we can explain what's going on with these weird sentences. So I do that in the book, and I explain why I don't think the paracomplete or paraconsistent approaches actually help anything. Just for fun, if you want to if you have sort of Marxist-y dialectical reasons for not liking classical logic, read the first book, give them an argument, and you'll find out in there why I don't buy that idea, why I think that the idea that there's a conflict between those two things doesn't really make sense to me. But that is enough philosophy for today.
And don't buy the book yourself. Get your library to buy.
Yeah, well, give them an argument. You can buy that one.
Well, that way, yeah.
Yeah, but don't, you don't need to spend $100 on the
Lucille, come spend a few weeks at Barnes and Noble with me.
She'll get you up to speed. You'll be doing spitting out, chewing up truth tables and spitting out proofs. All right. So enough philosophy for today. If you want to find out how I think you can solve the liar paradox, read that book through your library. And meanwhile, we're going to go to the post game with Matt McManus. We're going to watch another of those Leo and Layla PragerU videos. We are going to watch a Republican congressman make a surprising statement about the dangers of furries. We're going to be talking about that new Daily Beast article. A lot of good stuff is going to be going on in the post game. So remember to check, see that post game. Patrons already have the link in their inbox, or certainly if they go to the Patreon, they should see it. And if you are not a patron yet, that is $5 a month. That is, in 1994 when Pulp Fiction came out, you could already get, that was already just the cost of a single milkshake.
We need to keep Lucy in dental treats.
So keep Lucy in dental treats. Keep J. Andrew World and drawing supplies. Support the work that we're doing here. Help us keep it going. You get access to those exclusive post games after every regular episode. Discord server that's been off a little bit on hiatus, but the Sopranos recap episodes are coming back soon, and a lot else. And most importantly, our eternal love and gratitude. So,
Team Snoopy forever.
Left is best.